Welcome to everyone. People still joining us. We have the exciting prospect this evening of an hour of Ehren Jordan's time. He is quite one of the most thoughtful, interesting, and eloquent people we get to work with. Really interesting man. We've got a lot to talk about. He took the stereotypical route into wine by studying classical archaeology and fine art. But then when he got his foot in the door, he realized that if he was any good at it, he would live the dream of spending his time wearing a t-shirt and not shaving. And true to form, I'm very proud of him. He's attired correctly. He's been through something of a roller coaster through harvest, and prior to this, we were just commenting on it. So it's been a difficult time for Ehren, but the focus tonight is happier days for him of the 18 vintage. So that's going to be the release coming up, looking at 3 vineyards. Ehren does an array of different places, but it's just 3 vineyards. We're talking about 2 grape varietals, but the focus is the 18. So for Ehren, I can pass over to you, and yeah, if you could reiterate some of the things you've been through in the last month, that'd be very interesting.
Sure. Thanks, Sam. Hi, everyone. Ehren Jordan. It is not night here in California. It's actually late morning, a beautiful day. We're headed for about 27 C and sunshine. I was just chatting with everyone prior to getting on the call to say, you do realize what's happened in California and Oregon this year, right? We're all clear. We had sort of an mildly unprecedented harvest. I believe this was harvest 35 for me, and it's I can quite easily say that I've never experienced a harvest quite like this. And you will note as I go through this, I'm actually the eternal optimist. So I'm pretty upbeat, even though we've had a pretty tough go of it. We had a very unusual weather pattern in the latter part of August, where we had an electrical storm. And I mean, for those of you that live in places where electrical storms happen normally, I grew up in one, so thunder and lightning is not a big deal. I have lived in California for over 30 years now, and I can count on 3 fingers the times that I have seen lightning and heard thunder in Napa and Sonoma County. One of them being the latter part of August this year. We were actually picking grapes at my estate vineyard where I'm sitting. I'm in my fabulous barn here. And we noticed these sort of flashes on the horizon, and I wasn't really sure what it was because we just don't see lightning that often, and there was no thunder. It had been warm, and so it finally dawned on us all that it was heat lightning, and so sort of cloud to cloud lightning. And as the night wore on and the storm approached, it became cloud to ground lightning. And I mean, we had a real electrical storm. And so it chased us out of the vineyard. Actually, we were picking grapes, and there was a point at which I said, standing in a flat field full of metal stakes is probably not a safe place for all of us to be right now. It was about 4 o'clock in the morning, maybe 3:45. And so we just said, okay, we're done picking. And I drove the tractor back down to the barn, which is where I'm sitting. And we have a big pad out front where I stack grapes at night. And then in the morning, I load them onto a truck and take them to the winery. And at that point, it started raining quite violently. And so I began hauling the grapes into the barn. My wife, of course, ran out of the house in her robe and yelling at me to get off the forklift because there's lightning bolts sort of coming down all around us. And I said, no, it's okay. The forklift has rubber tires. I'm grounded. Don't worry. Loaded all the grapes into the winery and stopped, or into the barn, stopped for the evening. And the unfortunate consequence of the electrical storm is it's been quite dry in California, as it is pretty much every summer. We had a particularly dry winter with about 50% of our average annual rainfall. So, it's always dry here. It's, when I moved to California, people say, what's the Golden State? And I said, well, it's kind of really the brown state. It's quite brown in the summertime. It dries out, and we don't typically see rain. We have this drought that goes from late April, early May, that all the way into October and November, we see 0 rain. So all those lightning strikes started a bunch of fires. Unfortunately, in the Napa Sonoma area, precisely 2 fires were started. One, well, actually there were 3. 2 of them merged together into a very large fire in the eastern part of Napa County, and it actually expanded out into some other counties. And by large, I think that one got to about 375,000 acres. So it got into the top 5 all-time biggest forest fires in California. Of perhaps more consequence to myself was a smaller fire that started north of the Russian River in Sonoma County. Never got that big, but managed to get upwards of, I think it was about 60,000 acres. But the smoke from that fire was much more impactful to the growing areas that I tend to traffic in, Russian River Valley, Sonoma Coast. And I mean, a pretty dense blanket of fog. We were sort of joking about it. We got chased out of the vineyard, or we picked by lightning one night, and then 2 nights later we were picking by firelight because the fire was close enough to my house that I could see it quite clearly, and it was maybe 4 miles away. So we picked the vast majority of our home ranch here before the difficult part turned into, as the wind slackened, the smoke sat. And when the smoke sits, the smoke lands on your grapes and vineyards, and you have this potential for issue. It's not a guarantee, and it just sort of depends on grape variety and exposure time and distance to fire and age of smoke, and there are all these things. But you know, there were vineyards that we ended up not picking as a result, which is, you know, difficult to do. You've spent the entire year farming, and suddenly it's full of ash, and you know, it just, you can't make wine from it. And the whole time this was going on, we have a winery in St. Helena in Napa County. We also have a winery in the Willamette Valley in Oregon. And the entire time that this smoke saga was sort of unfolding in California, in the back of my mind, I said, well, but at least we have Oregon. And then the fire started in Oregon. And so the Willamette Valley then experienced a very similar situation to California. These fires were in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains, so they weren't really in the Willamette Valley, but the smoke was blowing to the Willamette Valley. And you know, we've had the same issues. So you know, we continue to pick vineyards. We have rejected some in the field. We have taken in fruit that we're unclear on its status, and you know, I sort of look at it and say, I own the winery, let's make the wine. And if it doesn't work out, we've been through this before. We've been through multiple years where we've had smoke issues. And, you know, as a consumer, I mean, people don't realize it because we don't bottle those wines. We just get rid of them. Because I can't sell you a wine that has smoke taint and look you in the eye and say, what you really need here is to lick an ashtray. That would be great. So those wines just get, you know, sadly, there's really no remedy for it. I shouldn't say there's no remedy. The remedy for smoke is so drastic that for someone who is about artisanal and handmade, it ruins the wine. The wine is ruined by smoke, but it's also ruined by charcoal filtration and PVPP and reverse osmosis and all the things required. It completely neuters the wine and doesn't render it functional on a single vineyard. You know, if Romani Conti did that to their wines, you know, it would need to be sold in bulk to some negociant to be put into a vin de pays. That's the severity of the cure. I don't know that the cure is worse than the issue, but it's right up there with it. So, so that's what's been going on in California and Oregon. You know, given what I've seen with these fires, what I say to people is my winery is still standing. None of my employees lost their homes. Everybody is safe and healthy. And I couldn't say that in 2017. I had multiple employees whose homes burned down. So as fires go, if the only thing we lost was grapes and wine, I'm fine with that. I mean, if it happens every single year, I start to have an issue with it. But in the grand scheme of life, farming is farming. If it was easy, everyone would do it. And it's not, and it's full of risk and reward. And the reward is the wines that you have in your glass. 2018, to contrast it with 2020, was one of those, I call it the Goldilocks vintage. It was just perfect. It was not too hot and not too cold and not too windy and not too rainy. And the crop wasn't too big, but it wasn't too small. It was absolutely perfect. And if someone said to me, if you had one vintage to live over and over again, which would it be? I would say 2018, no questions. Love the wines. It's sort of everything that California can be in the greatest years. And California has issues like every other climate in the world. And, I would say, unlike Burgundy, our issues tend to be it's too hot. And, sometimes we have fabulous weather during bloom and the crop, the yields can be too big. But 2018 was one of those years where we just had this incredibly moderate growing season. We had no massive heat spikes late in the year. And the crop was healthy, but it wasn't massive. And so it's one of those years. It's kind of a bit of a juxtaposition to be talking about the chaos of 20 while drinking 18 and thinking about the beauty that was 18. But
so we should get started. It's 7:15 and people in the UK and people will be thirsty for their first wine.
Oh, don't let me stop you from drinking.
Could I ask you to tell us a little bit about the Platt vineyard?
Yes, absolutely. So
thank you.
It's kind of an interesting story. So Lou Platt, if you were to Google him, he would show up right away. He was the CEO of, I should Google him. Was it HP? Maybe not HP. A very large company. I'm going to get my phone out and Google Lou Platt. I apologize for not having this right on the tip of my tongue. But he retired from that position, a global company. There we go, Louis E. Platt. Hewlett Packard, I was right, it was HP. So retired CEO of Hewlett Packard, and he was befriended, sorry for the noise. This is a working farm, and post-harvest we farm biodynamically. We are currently spreading our compost pre-rainy season compost. So we've been working on it all summer, spring and summer. So Lou Platt was the CEO of HP, a local vintner of modest, well-renowned, a guy named Jess Jackson, at the earlier stages of Kendall Jackson. I think it was the stage where they were going from big to really big, decided that he could use some corporate governance from outside the wine industry. So he convinced Lou Platt to be the CEO of Kendall Jackson. So Lou and his wife bought a 550-acre ranch above the town of Bodega. If you're an Alfred Hitchcock enthusiast and you've ever seen the movie The Birds, from the Platt Vineyard, you're looking down into the town of Bodega where The Birds was filmed, the church, all very visible, but extremely far out on the Sonoma coast. So this is, you can see the water from the vineyard. He bought it as a retreat. Lou lived down in the peninsula, the Bay Area. HP's headquarters was Silicon Valley. So he bought this piece of property, he built a house, and he used it when he was up in Sonoma County. At some point, I believe Dave Ramey convinced him that it wasn't actually too cold. When he bought the property, he was not thinking grapes. He thought it's too cold out here. It's not, there are no vineyards in the area. So that wasn't the intent. It was more of a private retreat. The driveway is almost 2 miles long to get up to the house through a grove of redwood trees. Quite spectacular. And he was convinced to plant a vineyard. It's not a giant vineyard. It's about 30 acres. It's 2/3 Chardonnay a third, Pinot Noir, and it is on the ragged edge of where you can get grapes ripe in the western part of Sonoma County. So very heavily fog influenced, and it's just a magical spot. It's sort of draped in fog. There's redwood trees all around it. I mean, I personally think it's sort of the future of Burgundian viticulture in California because it doesn't get too hot. And while Chardonnay can tolerate a little bit of heat, Pinot Noir can't. And, you know, Chardonnays, if you're interested in making more acid-driven wines and less fruit-forward, fruit-dominated wines, like, I mean, California does that because it's the nature of our climate. Long growing season, cool growing season, and so that's the Platt Vineyard. It's a really magical spot.
Can I ask what the classic characteristics are of the wines from Platt?
Sorry, I'm not drinking. It's 11:15 here, so I know it's afternoon somewhere in the world. But I am going to spit. There's just a great So for me, I'm much more of a the way a wine moves across my palate is the thing that draws me in, and this wine has that sort of mouth-watering mid-palate clench, that acid. You know, it again, mid-palate acidity is what gets your mouth watering, and for me, it's what California frequently lacks because we have so much warmth that the wines tend to be richer, more robust, and to find natural acidity of this type, I find really appealing. You know, my personal drinking habits veer much more European because of that that acidity level, and I get that with this wine. Yeah, there's sort of I mean, there are some tropical notes to it. Again, I'm probably the least effective describer of specific flavors. For me, it's a wine. I mean, everybody experiences wine in their own way, and for me, it's this textural situation. And so I'm always working on building texture in the wine, and to that end, with this wine, I think it's important to note, while inspired by things European, you know, I think if you go to Burgundy, it would be very unusual to not see a cellar full of 228-liter Burgundian barrels. I do like those, and I use them. However, I also tend to use a lot of 500-liter barrels. This wine actually, about 25% of it was fermented and aged in concrete. A tiny percent was done in stainless steel just to guard that kind of edge to it. The wines, and this is a collective across all of my wines, we don't add anything to the wines. I don't really add SO2 to these wines until well after they're done with malolactic fermentation. So these wines are fermented with native yeast. They have no manipulation. They're spontaneous malolactic ferments. I did see a question about Riesling from Platt, like Radio Coteau. I would love to do that. The problem is they grafted all of that Riesling over to Pinot Noir because nobody would pay enough for the Riesling. And you know, the crass economics of it like reared their head. The vineyard actually sold. Lou Platt passed away. His wife ran it for a while and just said, I'm not really spending that much time up there. And so the new owners, having paid top dollar, decided that Riesling was no longer in their future, which is sad because the Rieslings were incredible. And I tried to convince them not to graft it over, but when they proposed the price for Riesling, I said, you know, I can go to Oregon and buy Riesling that's arguably every bit as good and from a really cold climate as well, and pay, you know, 1/10 of the price. But that's another story. So I acknowledge the Platt Riesling, and sadly is no longer there.
And then turning to the 2016, could you tell us a little about that vintage and the challenges?
So 2016, fascinatingly, was the last year that we made wine where there wasn't a fire. So we had fires in 17, 18, 19, and now 20. The 2016 vintage was a bit of a, funny how you sort of categorize things. So 2015 on the Sonoma coast was a year of phenomenally small yields, sort of unreasonably small yields. And I always have to think about hectoliters per hectare if I'm talking to folks in Europe. So, I mean, we were seeing yields between 1/2 and 3/4 of a ton to the acre. So that would be 7 hectoliters to about 10 hectoliters per hectare. Almost where it kind of looked like the vineyard might have been picked at night with bad lights. So they missed a cluster here and there where you would walk along and say, you missed one right here, let's pick it. That type of smallness of yield. That was 15. So then 16 came along, and 16 was, while not a giant harvest, it was so much bigger than 15 that it felt big. Also in hindsight was this sort of last hurrah of not massive wildfires during harvest. So I look back very fondly on 16. Again, with Platt, there are no real hot vintages out there. I mean, a super hot day at Platt would be sort of 27 C. That might, I mean, 80 degrees is like, and it won't be that temperature for long. It'll peak and then drop back down very quickly. So not dissimilar growing conditions to 18. In fact, I think 16 might have been a bit colder than 18. I know when we picked, and so I'd have to look at yields and try to extrapolate out a little bit. 16 had a slightly bigger yield than 18, but we picked quite a bit later. So at aggregate, it was a little cooler. Yeah, I mean, the Platt Vineyard has over the years sold fruit to a bit of a who's who of small artisanal producers in the West County of Sonoma for Pinot and Chardonnay. So it's one of those sites that, you know, I mean, I'm very focused on European wines in my own personal drinking, and you know, as someone that makes wine in California, it's very difficult to. I think a lot of California winemakers like to say, this is a Grand Cru site. And I say, well, I mean, this site has been farmed for 25 years. I mean, let's not go there yet. You know, we've been farming grapes in California for 150 years. So let's not even go near that topic yet. And, you know, arguably the first 100 of those years, people didn't even grow Chardonnay. So we have a very brief track record of what we're doing. And, you know, I think the general trajectory we are currently headed in, which is closer to the coast, more modulated by the water. Our water here, I believe, is colder than the water off the shores of the UK. Maybe not like way up in Scotland, but the water here is really cold. So you have to think about the way we get our water. So most of you have the Gulf Stream bringing water from the Gulf of Mexico up the east coast of the U.S. across the northern Atlantic and hitting hitting continental Europe and the UK. And we have the reverse. We have the current runs from the Gulf of Alaska south down the west coast. So our ambient water temperature in the Pacific, which is about 15 miles from where I'm sitting, right now is about 11 C. It's cold. And that's the surface temperature is 11 C. If you go down, it gets much colder very quickly. So we have this giant refrigerator just offshore. And as someone in pursuit of cooler climate viticulture, the closer you get to that refrigeration source, the cooler it gets. And I mean, we get very hot inland temperatures, and it's actually one of the odd phenomenons of sort of climate change, global warming, which is as the inner areas of California heat up, hot air rises, and what it does is it sucks cool air off the water to fuel that upward phenomenon. And so we've actually had some very cold vintages as a result. As you get closer and closer to the water, that cool down happens. So I mean, I do think it's the future of grape growing in this part of the world. And as viticultural advances have happened, and rootstocks and trellising, you see people pushing closer and closer to the water. I mean, there are some seemingly finite boundaries, and finite is one of those strange terms, but you know, if you're below certain levels in certain areas, you tend to be in the fog continuously, which is not good for growing grapes. So in every spot, you sort of find that point where above X altitude, you can get grapes right. And you know, Platt is at about, well, the bottom of the vineyard's about 300 feet of elevation. The top is about 600 feet. And it seems to work. The bottom reaches are a little cold. That being said, I actually get grapes from the lowest block on the property, but it's not Chardonnay. Chardonnay needs a little more warmth. It's Pinot Noir. And you know, I like that because we can do 100% whole cluster Pinot Noir. We get tremendous physiological ripeness in our stems at much lower typical sugars in California, which for me is very exciting. So I did see a question on there about my use of concrete. So again, if you travel in Europe, especially in France, and think about where you encounter concrete, it tends to be across the northern swath. So, I mean, you see a lot of concrete in Champagne, and then you see it across the southern swath. You see, I mean, if you're in Châteauneuf-du-Pape or the Côte-du-Rhône village, and so, you know, I always get into the, well, why? Well, so concrete is a great ameliorator of super high acid wines, and it's also a great ameliorator of very high tannin wines. So obviously people in Champagne are picking very high acid wines, and people in the South are picking Grenache, which is a very high tannin wine. And so concrete tends to round those rougher edges out. I use concrete predominantly with white wines in California because those tend to be the wines that have those acid edges. I don't, I'll use it with a little bit of Syrah in California. And then in Oregon, because we tend to use more whole cluster and we get more of that sort of rough tannic edge in the wines, we do we do white wine ferments in Oregon in concrete, but we also do Pinot Noir in concrete, especially the higher percentage whole cluster ferments. And again, it's that sort of rounding property. There's some great thermal properties to concrete. If you've been to a lot of California wineries, typically in their white wine production areas, it's very highly temperature controlled and very cold. And that to me produces wines of incredible sort of fruity characters. That the ethers and esters at super cold ferments tend to be a little overwhelming for me. And I mean, if you've been to Burgundy during harvest, you realize not a lot of people have temperature control in their cellars. And while they may be underground, the ferments get warm by California standards. So, I mean, I have to travel back and forth in my mind between C and F, but you know, most California white wine barrel rooms are kept at 55 Fahrenheit, which is 15C, 14C, somewhere in there. And we don't do that. Our winery is actually in a cave, so not unlike a lot of Burgundian cellars. And we allow the ferments to progress naturally and to get however hot they get. And what it tends to do at slightly more elevated fermentation temperatures with white wine is blow off some of that sort of tutti fruity fruit cocktail aroma, which I'm not particularly, I don't find that super appealing in white wine. You get to more sort of vinous qualities to the wine, which after all, it is wine. So that's kind of what I'm looking for. And the thing with me is I make the wine and I own the winery, so I get to do whatever I want, which, you know, there's a lot of California has become a lot like Bordeaux, where, you know, owning a winery in the Napa Valley has become a very wealthy person's pastime. It has become staggeringly expensive. And by the luck of the draw for me, I happened to get in at an earlier age where someone who didn't come from the wine industry, I grew up on the West Coast, my parents didn't really drink much wine, could actually earn my living making wine and buy a piece of property and build a winery and still have that all work out. So I see the question about, given the location of my vineyards in California, why my winery in the Napa Valley, which is a very astute question. And so I originally moved to California in 1990 and got a job working for a well-respected Cabernet Sauvignon winery. Well, actually, they made everything, but Cabernets were particularly well thought of, Joseph Phelps Vineyards. And then I left Phelps and I moved to Europe, and I worked in the Northern Rhone Valley for 2 harvests for a vigneron in Cornas named Jean-Luc Colombo. And when I came back to California, I got a job working for a woman named Helen Turley. And I was introduced to her brother, Larry Turley, and that became my day job for about 20 years. So I was the winemaker and general manager at a winery in St. Helena called Turley Wine Cellars, which if you've had Zinfandel from California, you may have crossed that path. That was a pretty consuming day job, sort of like of the 120-hour-a-week variety. And when I had launched my own winery and was actually making my wines at the Turley Winery, and this piece of property where my winery now is became available for sale, fortuitously, it was about a mile away from Turley, which kind of allowed me to continue working a 120-hour-a-week day job and have my own side gig at my own winery. And that's kind of why it is where it is. I had this sort of chaotic daytime job, and the Turley Winery ended up, I mean, not only did Larry have a winery in St. Helena, but we bought a winery in Paso Robles and another 2 wineries up in the Amador foothills area of the Sierra Nevadas. So I ended up being on an airplane a lot, flying between wineries, which begat the fact that I now have a winery in Oregon because I got into flying airplanes, and that just became normal. So now I fly between wineries. So that's why my winery is in the Napa Valley. I mean, someday I'll probably build a winery in Sonoma County. It does seem like the more logical thing to do, and would cut my commute down quite a bit. And as the global real estate scene continues to heat up, I have realtors calling me and saying, you know, what would it take to dislodge you from that facility? How much money can we throw your way? And, you know, at some point someone will entertain a number that will get my attention, I'm sure, and I'll just build another winery over in Sonoma, which is more germane to what I do anyway. So a long answer to a very short but astute question.
And as we turn to the Pinots, you had this experience of making Cabernets and Zinfandels. Was the movement to Pinot just love of the grape variety, or was there anything else you'd say on that? And then if I could ask you to talk about Occidental too, please.
Yeah, so I mean, it was funny. When I started Failla, I mean, I had this day job making, you know, what some people, always fascinating, the reaction to the Turley wine. Sorry, I'm opening a wine. If I'm looking down here, it's not at my phone, it's at this corkscrew. You know, I joke and say there were 2 customers that were when I first started making the Failla wines. I had all the people that were Turley customers, and to describe the Turley wines, if you've not had them, they're very powerful, you know, sort of the Barossa Shiraz of Zinfandel. I mean, 15, 16% alcohol, super old vineyards, very concentrated, very powerful wines. And so all of those customers said, oh, you're making Pinot Noir, we want that. And so those people were frequently disappointed by the Failla wines because, you know, and then the people that ultimately became the Failla customers sort of did one of these, like, no, no Pinot Noir from the guy that makes those wines. That can't possibly be good. And I would run after them saying, no, I can make light ethereal wines too. I mean, I always say to people, so it's not an uncommon thing. Like, you could have a Chablis to start your meal and a bottle of Chateauneuf to finish. Like, that's not an uncommon thing. Like, you would do that. You would go into your cellar and say, well, these are all the dishes we're serving, and we're going to start with this delicious or champagne, but we might finish with a wine from the south of France, or say a Barolo or a Barbaresco that might be 14.8 or 15 alcohol. And so that's not a leap in anybody's mind. Now, of course, making both of them might be a leap in people's mind, but I don't know. I mean, I'm fascinated by winemaking, so for me, that's not much of a leap. It took a little while to convince people that the same person might be able to occupy both mental spheres. But, you know, we are not climatically France. I mean, because of this giant refrigerator of the Pacific, you can go relatively short distances and encounter climatic variation, much like you would driving 5 hours in France. So you can be out on the coast in an area that barely gets Pinot Noir ripe, and, you know, California standards of, you know, say 13.5 or 14% alcohol versus, you know, Pinot Noir struggling to get to 12.8 on the coast. I mean, that's cold. And you sort of had to re-educate a lot of California wine makers to the fact that, you know, we think of bricks versus potential alcohol, but, you know, that it's okay to pick at 21 bricks. I mean, I made Syrah in 1998 from a vineyard that I picked in November at, it was 20.4 bricks, which is a potential alcohol of right around 12. And the grower apologized to me and said, I won't charge you for the fruit because obviously it's ruined. And I said, well, I'm going to give you a slightly different perspective. So if you're in Cornas and you pick at 12% potential alcohol, while it's not the vintage of the century, it might be the vintage of the decade. You know, modern times excluded, but I mean, back in the day, I mean, Cornas at 12% natural alcohol, no problem. I mean, I might chaptalize it by half a degree or maybe a degree, really more to extend the fermentation, but nobody would say boo about that. And so I think the more American winemakers really thought about the wines that they were drinking, that they were inspired by, and were like, oh, wait a minute, that wine's only 12.5% alcohol. Like, that, what did that sugar look like? And I mean, working at Turley, I had a lot of people say, you know, I'm waiting for the flavor profile. And I mean, my retort to that is, human beings like sweet things. The sweeter the grapes, the better they taste. Like, if you're waiting for the grapes to be sweet, you're going to be making 15% alcohol wine, because grapes taste really good at 25 bricks. They just do. They don't taste nearly as good at 22 bricks. They're actually a little acidic, and, you know, so if you want to train your palate for that to be good, that's great. But you do have to understand where you're going with the ultimate purpose, which is not to eat grapes, but to make wines that inspire people and that inspire yourself. So, so I am weirdly capable of holding all those ideas in my brain at once, and I can go make a 15.5% alcohol Zinfandel and turn around and make a 11% alcohol Riesling and be completely satisfied with my day. And I'm probably the kind of person that if I owned 1 hectare in Burgundy and only had one grape variety, would be bored out of my mind. So, you know, that, and obviously that's starting to change now, because it used to be you might encounter one Burgundian producer and that's all they did. But now, I mean, you look at things like Pelican up in the Jura, where you have a Burgundy producer saying, well, I'm going to buy that winery in the Jura. And I mean, 50 years ago, that never would have happened. That would sort of be some sort of sacrilege. Like, why would you ever leave Burgundy and go to the Jura? That's, plebes live in the Jura. What are you doing up there? Type thing. And so the sort of globalization of wine drinking, not necessarily a globalization of wine making, but I mean, I lived in France in the early 90s, and if you walked into a restaurant in the Rhone Valley and tried to buy Bordeaux, I mean, with the exception of the 3-star Michelin restaurants, they would look at you like you had three heads and say, what? Board what? I don't know what that is. Never heard of it before. And, you know, the incredibly, I mean, I just remember being in Cornos when someone would drive down Main Street with a 2.6 license plate from the Drôme, which is across the Rhone River. You could throw a rock and hit it. And they would get scowls like, where is this foreigner coming from? 2.6, who is that? It's crazy. I'm like, it's the guy from across the river. It's not a foreigner. Like, I'm the foreigner. I've got the Pennsylvania license plate on my car. And you're giving stink eye to the guy from across the river? Come on, what are you doing? But I mean, that's France. I have friends here like, oh, the French are rude. And I'm like, French are rude to Americans. I'm like, the French are rude to the French. Come on, what are you talking about? You know, not in the countryside, but I mean, the Parisians are kind of rude to everybody, but New Yorkers are rude to everybody too. I think it's like a big city phenomenon. You get very insular and you don't pay attention to other people. So what? But yeah, my general motto in life is if you have half as much fun drinking these wines as I do making them, we're all in for a really good time. So if it is not obvious, I do love what I do.
And sorry, dragging you back to the Occidental.
This is why you obviously need a moderator, because I will discourse freely on large scale topics. So Occidental Ridge is a, as the crow flies, actually from Platt, not that far away. I think it's about 1.5 miles as the crow flies. It is moving north and east, so you're moving inland. And it's a slightly more elevated site. So I tend to think of the wines as a little more muscular. There's a little more warmth here. You've moved from maybe, I mean, on the Pinot Noir side, I say you've moved from like Volnay-Pommard more up into the Côte de Nuit, a little more oomph to the wines. They're just, it's the nature of the site. It is, while a warmer area, this is a cooler spot in as much as it is northwesterly exposed, so a pretty continuous and even slope, but northwesterly, which again, you know, it depends on where you are. Sometimes the southern slope is great because you need that heat accumulation to get grapes ripe. Sometimes a northerly slope can be to your benefit because it moderates some of the maybe afternoon heating. And of course, I'm talking northern hemisphere because if you go to the southern hemisphere, then the northern slope is a warm slope. But so this is a vineyard that was planted in 1998. So it's not particularly old, but I mean, there really aren't any old vine Pinot Noir and Chardonnay vineyards for the most part in California. Not by, I always say, I put my Turley hat on and say there are no old vine Chardonnay and Pinot Noir vineyards because at Turley, we had Zinfandel vineyards that were 160 years old. Amongst the oldest vines still productive in California. And that just doesn't happen with Pinot Noir and Chardonnay because 100 years ago, the people growing grapes in California weren't people growing Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. They were mostly immigrants from Italy who were planting these sort of mixed black vineyards where, you know, Zinfandel, but companion varieties, Petit Syrah, Carignan, Alicante Bouschet, things of that nature. You know, Pinot Noir and Chardonnay didn't really show up until the late 50s into the 60s. And most of those vineyards have been torn out because of disease pressure and phylloxera and things of that nature. So Occidental Ridge, I mean, I think of it as a mature vineyard. It certainly has hit its stride. I've been buying fruit from this vineyard since the current owners purchased it in 2005. So I do have a bit of a track record with it. I find it to be, again, one of the more, of the California single vineyard wines that we have. It is certainly one of the most sturdy, if you will, the more brooding flavor of Pinot Noir. You know, on the Pinot side, our production methods are pretty simple. Open top fermenters, whether they be concrete, stainless steel, or wood. Super minimal manipulation. The destemming whole cluster question is I'm very non-dogmatic about that. I feel like those decisions are, we would refer to them as a game time decision. So the moment that those grapes are actually at the winery and I'm sort of chewing on stems is when I decide how much whole cluster to utilize. Always some. It tends to be in California that the percentages skew to the lower side. So a wine like the Occidental Ridge would have maybe 25% whole cluster, whereas the foil, as we move to Oregon, that Seven Springs wine would be more like 50% or 70% whole cluster. And that just has to do with the physiological ripeness of the stems. So I think of it as a stem maturity in the US is sort of like the 16 or 17-year-old boy who might be 6'3" or 4", but only weighs 160 pounds. They're not physiologically there yet. Whereas in Oregon, because of the a little further north latitudes, you tend to get a little more coincidence of physiological ripeness with sugar maturity. You know, looping back around, so 18 was this sort of Goldilocks vintage. 13 is, you sort of have to, there's a dividing line in 13 that runs down sort of Highway 101. So, and they're 12 and 13 were mirror images in Napa and Sonoma. 12 in Sonoma was a tiny crop, and in Napa was a big crop, and 13 was a larger crop in Sonoma and a smaller crop in Napa. So the 13 Occidental is what I would call sort of a classic California year. A little bit bigger crop, a little bit warmer, sort of a rounder wine. You know, I used to think of the age worthiness component for me, and you know, a lot of these coastal wines will deceive you because in a year like 13, where perhaps it was, you know, on the spectrum of warmth, a warmer than average year, and so you'll get these fruitier upfront flavors with the wine. I always say, don't be deceived by the forwardness of some of these wines. They actually do retain tremendous acidity, which, as that sort of baby fat resolves and falls away, they're shockingly long-lived. And I would go back to even 2001. While I didn't get fruit from Occidental Ridge in 2001, I have other vineyards out on the coast, and another year that was more classically Californian, so a vintage that skewed toward the earlier, a little warmer year. And at the time I thought, well, these are lovely wines. They won't last very long, and they're still phenomenal. And they were actually the first wines where I experienced a more European take on the wines, which is they actually gained some gravitas as they got older. And I think historically in California, especially with Pinot Noir, it's sort of like what you saw in the beginning was what you got, and they became simpler as they got older. And I think now, as we've pushed the boundaries outward towards the coast and into these cooler areas, while we do have hints of, you know, the warmth that California can experience, and I would say more the lack of continental climate. So this is the part where warm is relative. So what we don't have in Western Sonoma County is extreme cold. And so, you know, you think of a cooler climate growing area, and so people will say, well, Oregon is cooler climate. And that's a hard one to grapple with. And I would say always, Oregon is more European in climate, in as much as it is colder in the winter and warmer in the summer. What California has is this really moderate climate because of the Pacific Ocean. So, you know, I always say, look around at the other things growing. So you look around in Burgundy and it's oak trees. There's no palm trees. There's certainly no citrus, where that actually does exist in California. And the reason is we don't have these bitter cold spells because we're not a continental climate. We're a maritime climate. And we're a maritime climate that has a really constant ocean temperature. The ocean temperature here fluctuates about 2 or 3 degrees C. That's it. It's phenomenally consistent. And so that gives us this strange and very elongated growing seasons. I mean, this year we had bud break in late February, which coupled with our super dry winter was not great because we had actually frost damage this spring, which we had quite a small crop, which ended up helping us out on some level because we were able to pick some things before it really fire started getting going here. So that was a really long-winded answer to the question of how the 2013 harvest was. But
my question now, as we move on to Seven Springs, is if you were presented with a glass of what you knew was US Pinot, what would steer you to thinking it was from California and what from Oregon? What are making a broad generalization on that front? And whilst you're there, please tell us about Seven Springs and Oregon. And
yeah, so I'll step back for a second and just give you the overview of Seven Springs. So the Willamette Valley in Oregon is quite large. It actually goes from the town of Eugene in the south. If you were driving on Interstate 5, it goes all the way to Portland, and that would be, it's funny, I've actually never driven it, but I believe that to be about a 2.5 or 3 hour drive. So it's quite large. The Willamette Valley writ total is quite large. The part that we all talk about is the extreme northeastern part of the Willamette Valley. So there is a weather phenomenon, a geological phenomenon, or I should say a topographical phenomenon called the Van Duzer corridor, which is a slight depression in the coastal hills that allows cool coastal air into the Willamette Valley. And that corridor hits the Willamette Valley at about the town of Salem, which is, call it, a third of the way between Portland in the north and Eugene in the south. And so weirdly, the coldest part of the valley is right there, where the Willamette, or where the, sorry, I've got a tractor outside, where the Van Duzer corridor runs into the main valley floor is the coldest part. Aha, I see that character. I have one of those as well. In fact, he's about to come home from school and is very excited because we get to drive the little Bobcat and load the hopper on the tractor. In fact, he didn't want to go to school today. It was sort of a screaming match because we were loading the spreader with compost and all he wanted to do was drive the Bobcat. But so north-south is kind of not germane to temperature as much in the Willamette Valley. It's that sort of where the Van Duzer corridor hits is the coolest part. And as you move north from there, it gets warmer. And as you move south from there, it gets warmer. All that being said, there is a sub-appellation within the Willamette Valley called the Eola Amity Hills, which starts, the southern part of it is right at the sort of entry point of the Van Duzer corridor. And these are just, it's a hill formation that starts down at almost sea level, like the valley floor is about 100 feet elevation there, rises up to about 800 feet and drops down. It's just a little spine. It's maybe 10 miles long. So that's the Eola Amity Hills. And the Seven Springs Vineyard is in the Eola Amity Hills. You know, in California, as you get closer to the coast, you think about elevation as it relates to fog and being able to get grapes ripe. In Oregon, especially in the Willamette Valley, I think about elevation not because of climate, but because of geology. So there was a phenomenon, I want to say it was 15,000 years ago, there was an ice dam in Montana, what is today Montana, that as the last ice age receded, it broke, and there's a phenomenon in the Willamette Valley called the Missoula floods. And that ice dam breaking scoured material, topsoil, and into the Willamette Valley. It was caught by the coastal hills and that material precipitated out. And so below about 300 feet, it depends on where you are, you have much heavier clay-based soils. As you move above 300 feet, you get into this zone of much more primary soils, basalt, volcanics, primarily in Oregon. And that's where it gets very interesting. And in Oregon, that ends relatively rapidly because you get too high and it's too cold. You can't get grapes ripe. So it's like 300 to 800 feet. So it's this band that goes all the way around this little island of this island of rock that's jutting up above the valley. And so Seven Springs sits on the southeastern flank of the Eola Amity Hills. It's a, you know, historic sites in Oregon are even younger than historic sites in California. So the Oregon grape industry really got going in the late 60s, and sort of staggered forward for a decade or so. And the Seven Springs vineyard was planted in the early 1980s, and has become a synonymous, I mean, it's one of those sites that has been acknowledged as, aha, a lot of people have made wine from this place and it's really good, you know, across an arc of producers. So that's kind of the general setup of Seven Springs. You know, from a California, Oregon perspective, like texturally, the Oregon wines to me are very different. There's more tannin, there's less obvious sort of fruit sunshine qualities. I mean, that line has been blurred a little bit of late, and I would say the reason some of that blurring has occurred is if you go back to the 60s and 70s and look at those very early sites, so late 60s, early 70s, most of those vineyards were planted in the hottest places in the Willamette Valley. And the reason they were planted in the hottest places was viticulture was very rudimentary. Most vineyards were unrooted. They had no trellis system. They might have one wire and the grapes sort of flopped over. There were very wide spacings. Historically, that part of the world has been a very large hazelnut production area. So people had big wide tractors to farm their hazelnut orchards, and they just said, well, I'll use that in the vineyard. So you get these big sort of 8x12 spacings, much like California in the 60s. Very inefficient canopies. And so if you wanted to get grapes ripe, you had to go to the hottest places. And so if you fast forward to today, where most of those old vineyards have been torn out and you now are applying, you know, I would say modern viticulture to things, but much denser plantings, sort of shorter cycling rootstocks. I mean, you know, blasphemy, but people actually now irrigate in Oregon, although a lot of the vineyards are dry farm. Seven Springs is dry farm. What's happened is there are now producers in some of these hotter climates in Oregon that are creating, you know, wines that are 15% alcohol Pinot Noir. So that to me is, you know, that's a topic of another day. That's not why I'm in Oregon. But yet as a result of that, what we've seen is this shift into the cooler places of the Willamette Valley. So sort of the southern part of the Eola Hills, and even further now to the west of that, which is now called the Van Duzer Corridor appellation. Areas that, you know, 30 years ago, people would say, we can't get grapes ripe there, or maybe you can make sparkling wine from that location. So I tend to find a textural difference in Oregon, and you know, aromatically as well. California is much more, tends to be more fruit-driven, rounder wines, whereas Oregon, I've actually got the Seven Springs in my glass. It's just a grittier, more tannic, chewier component to the Oregon wine. Not negative, not good or bad, just different. There's a lot of interstate angst between California and Oregon. And I of course, get to say, I'm not from either one. So take me out of the angst game. I grew up in Pennsylvania. I appreciate great Pinot Noir sites, and there are some in California and there are some in Oregon, and, you know, but I'm just going to let it stand there. I personally appreciate Oregon because of the fact that so again, this sort of cool climate, warm climate, what I say is compact climate. Oregon, like Burgundy, it snows in the winter time, but then because it's much further from the water, so I mean, whereas where I sit today is 15 miles from the water, I can be jumping in the Pacific if I chose to do that, although that would be very, there would be a lot of screaming if that happened. It takes me about 20 minutes to drive to the ocean. From Seven Springs, if you were to beeline it to the coast, you'd be there in 2.5 hours. Much further inland. So consequently, when it warms up in the summer, it stays warm. Our diurnal swings in Sonoma County are massive, like 50 degrees Fahrenheit diurnal swing. It can be 58 degrees, or 52 degrees, or 50 in the day, and 100 or in the morning, and 100 in the afternoon. So 40 and 50 degree swings are not uncommon. In Oregon, that is much more uncommon. It gets warm and it sort of stays warm. And so what that does is, grapes need a certain amount of degree days to get ripe, and ripeness is relative, but they still need a certain amount of heat. And so Oregon gets that heat in a more compact way. Because it's warm, you tend to get thicker skins. The wines tend to have a little more rusticity is the wrong word, but more tannin, because the skins are thicker in Oregon. Pinot Noir tend to be than California, and yet because it's because it is further north, you're what we see is physiological ripeness. So let's say the stems are beginning to lignify at much lower sugars than you would see in California.
We've hit the hour, but you've got some questions coming in. You've touched on the 13 vintage.
Yeah, so,
you've got a couple of questions there.
Yeah, I just saw the one about the vinification style. So much more use of stems in Oregon and more use of concrete in order to round out that stem inclusion element in Oregon. It's funny, Oregon, I think of California where we need refrigeration to keep tanks cool, and in Oregon it's the reverse. We need to heat tanks to warm them up because, I was up there yesterday, and like I said, we're in the middle of harvest and the daytime high is 17, and you're trying to get things to ferment and get some heat to get some extraction. And so our electric bill is more about heating things than it is cooling them in Oregon. I'm not, if I touch my computer, I'll blow the video. So if there are questions, I see there are questions.
Finally, if you could touch one more, Fort Ross as an AVA.
Oh yeah, so Fort Ross, think about it for a second. So when I came back from France, I worked for Helen Turley. She had a vineyard out in the Fort Ross Seaview AVA. So this is an area that is north of where the Russian River runs into the Pacific at some elevation. So in order to be included in the AVA, you're I think you've got to be at 950 or 1,000 feet of elevation. It's very close to the water. So I source fruit from, I own a vineyard in the Fort Ross Seaview AVA, and then I buy grapes from David Hirsch and also a neighbor in between us named George Bowen. So again, it's that proximity to the water and elevation equation. So out there below 1,000 feet, you're so close to the water, it's too cold to get grapes ripe, even by the standards of, I would say, our modern standards of ripeness, which picking at 12.5 or 12.8 alcohol is still is okay. Very rugged, phenomenal geological variation. It's basically where the Pacific plate is going under the North American plate. We have a very famous fault here called the San Andreas Fault, and the Fort Ross Seaview AVA is sort of right on the edge of the San Andreas Fault. So you've had millions of years of this subduction, and so you think about plates, geologic strata are laid down over eons. But then because of subduction, those plates are turned on their edge. And then to add to it, it's really a temperate rainforest. We frequently get 100 inches of rain. So phenomenal erosion has exposed these layers that took millions of years to lay down are now 20 feet apart because of the fact that they've been turned on their ear. So this phenomenal soil variation, very cold. That climate, it begins to be more like Oregon, and because it is this compact season, you're so close to the water, and the influence of the water keeps it quite cold during the spring. It tends to be out there an area of low yield, not necessarily because of, it has everything to do with set. I always say, it's warm enough to get grapes ripe out there. The issue is the weather in late May and early June, which tends to be foggy and cool and windy. And so we get relatively small yields. And, the wines there, I think, tend to the more ethereal. They tend to be the more lacy, again, this is an AVA that's very, very new. The very first vines that were planted there were planted by Mick Bowen, who's the father of George Bowen, who I buy grapes from today. And that was 1973. And there just hasn't been a lot of vineyard out there for long. I mean, I frequently joke with David Hirsch, who I buy Pinot Noir from, that 50 years from now, his grandchildren or great-grandchildren might be laughing, saying, he grew Pinot Noir. That's hysterical. Because I think it may be a better place for Chardonnay. I'm still not sure. And I think David's site, he has an acre of Chardonnay and about 60 acres of Pinot Noir. And the Chardonnays, I keep saying, plant more Chardonnay. Plant more Chardonnay. I mean, the Pinot Noirs are great, but you know, my analogy is, I'm sure like if Jean-Francois Coche had Pinot Noir in his Corton vineyard, I'm sure it would be really good. But Chardonnay is even better. And so there's that element of, you know, it may be excellent Pinot Noir, but it could be extraordinary Chardonnay. So we'll see. We're still young in that AVA, and it's a fascinating place in as much as it's so geologically violent that literally it's these radical slopes up and down, and the only thing you can plant are these ridge tops. So I think the AVA is something on the order of 70,000 acres, but there are 400 acres of vineyard and really won't be appreciably more over time, because I mean, I have vineyard on this ridge top, and if you walk 50 feet, it drops off 400 feet in almost a straight down cliff into a, you know, a draw. And I mean, this was all redwood forest. It was logged repeatedly, especially aggressively post 1906, when the San Francisco earthquake sort of leveled the city and they had to rebuild everything. And they really went after the redwood trees on the North Coast. And a lot of the properties up there were purchased in the 70s and 80s from logging companies who had finally just sort of wrung them out as the logging technology got more and more sophisticated, and they could get further and further in and get these big logs out of these really remote areas. And they finally said, all right, we're done. Because redwood trees, you don't just sort of reseed them and have another crop. I mean, they live for thousands of years. I mean, I've got a 95 acre ranch, and I've got 10 acres of vineyard, and I've been in this now, oh boy, almost 30 acre reforestation program. I think we've planted 60,000 redwood trees. So, you know, my great grandchildren will have this spectacular redwood forest with these little islands of grapes up above. But yeah, Fort Ross Seaview is another great spot, and we do produce some wines from it. So check them out if you have time.
Thank you, Ehren. It is with regret I'm going to have to wind things up this evening. Thank you enormously for your time. Super interesting. To everyone else there, as always, I will send you an advanced preview of Ehren's 18s tonight when I get off this. But the offer proper will be out with you on Monday. But thank you to everyone for listening, and thank you hugely to Ehren for tonight.
Thanks, Sam. Great to see you all. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you. Hopefully, I'll be in the UK soon.
Please.
Thank you so much. That was amazing.